Braden and I are here at the Lindores Distillery, known as the birthplace of whiskey here in Scotland, the oldest distillery, I believe, in Scotland. So we're here for the official tour and tastings. It was really close to where we were staying, so it was a natural thing for us to come to. Roger just gave us the 1 minute drive here, and we're gonna go inside, so why don't you come along with me? In the background, you can also see the hills of the farm, my sister's farm that we're staying at. Up here they have an emblazoned bear in the hill up here that they light on fire once a year. And it should be fun, so let's go. We are inside for the distillery tour. Here are the tour prices. Not bad at all. Braid is just hitting the restroom, and then we are going to proceed into this special room right here.
So when we go around, just relax and enjoy it, okay? If you have any questions, please just ask, but pay attention. Okay? I'll be asking you questions at the end, just to make sure you're listening, okay? Don't be so worried, I'm only kidding. The monks arrived here from Tiron, small town, not too far from Paris, southwest of Paris in France. So for us here, 1191 is an important year, but probably more important is 1494. We learned the Viking public knowledge for the first time just 25 years ago, that in 1494 the monks in the abbey here made whisky for the Scottish king, King James IV at the time. As I said, the distillery is family owned. Helen and Drew, lovely couple, live in the farmhouse next door here. And Drew is the fourth generation of his family to own and run the farm. His great grandfather bought the farm originally in 1913, so they've been here for a long time. 25 years ago, when we learned about the story about the monks making whiskey for the king, Drew's father was still alive. He was living in the farmhouse at the time. He got a knock on the door out of the blue one day, and it turned out to be a man called Michael Jackson. But he wasn't standing doing the moonwalk on the doorstep. It wasn't that Michael Jackson. This particular Michael Jackson, at the time, was a famous author. He had written some books about the brewing industry, about making beer in the UK here. But he explained to Drew's father he was here because he was becoming more and more interested in whisky, especially the story of whisky in Scotland here. He was writing a book about it. When he released the book, it went on to become a bestseller around the world. It still is the biggest ever selling book on Scotch whisky. So he explained he was writing his new book. He was here, he was doing some research for it. And could he please have a look around in the Abbey ruins? Maybe take some photographs. Drew's father says, yes, carry on, help yourself, I don't care. But be careful, because that's where we keep the farm bull, in the Abbey ruins. And he didn't think much more of it until a few months later. After the book had been released, he received a copy in the post. Tucked inside the book, there was a little note to say, thank you for looking after me, for the hospitality when I came to visit. Have a look at page 126, and you might find out something of interest to your family. So this is when we discovered for the first time about the monks making whisky for the king. It's all recorded in what's called the Exchequer roll, like the tax records, the financial affairs for the king for the year. It's kept in the museum in Edinburgh now because of its importance, but it's a huge scroll, more than 30 yards long, all written in Latin. Up until that point, no one had ever bothered to translate before, so no one knew what it said. But Michael Jackson had learned, buried deep in the Latin script, there's a single line that describes how the king had delivered to the monks in the abbey here a measurement of barley. 8 bowls of malt. In today's terms, that would be a little bit less than half a ton. And it describes how the king commissioned the monks, or ordered them, I suppose, especially one in particular, Friar John Corr, from the barley, wherewith to make aquavitae for the king. Aquavitae is Latin for the water of life. In French, it's eau de vie. Can't remember what it is in Polish. I can't remember. or in Gaelic, the old Scots language, it's Uskaba or Uskabe, which in time became whisky. They all have the same meaning, the water of life. And this recording in the Exchequer Roll is acknowledged around the world now as being the earliest written evidence of whisky ever being made here in Scotland. So, huge discovery for the family. This is where whisky started in Scotland. It's like finding out the first place it was ever made was in your back garden. So, Helen and Drew, of course, made it their ambition in life to one day open a distillery on the site here and return whisky making to where it first began. So from its inception, from first ideas until we started production was 20 years. So, as I say, we started production in December 2017. So it's customary, of course, when you visit a whisky distillery in Scotland, you have a wee taste of the whisky at the end of it. We're no different here, you'll have a taste of our whisky. You'll also try our aquavitae. This is not whisky. To make a whisky in Scotland here, we're governed by very strict laws. We can only, for example, use 3 ingredients: water, barley and yeast, nothing else. From these 3 ingredients we make the spirit. This is our new make spirit. This is what comes from the stills in the distillery. That then must be matured in a cask made of oak, no other type of wood. It must be matured in Scotland here for a minimum of 3 years and 1 day before we can even call it Scotch whisky. So we started production in December 2017. So 18, 19, December 2020, we had our first whisky. Arrived here in 1191. They came by sea from France. They landed further up towards the mouth of the River Tay here, the river just behind the ruins. And they made their way down in this direction, looking for the perfect spot to establish an abbey. They picked it here. It's on the banks of the river, so it was perfect for transport and communication in these days. They had to feed themselves, obviously. They were farmers when they arrived. They wanted to cultivate the land. The land in this area in these days, it still is extremely fertile. So they got to work. They planted crops and vegetables, but most especially fruit trees, apples and pears and plums. Or they can be European. We're the same as every other distillery in Scotland. By far the vast majority of the casks that we use start life in the States. A few from Tennessee, most of them from Kentucky, and they've been used previously, of course, to mature bourbon whiskey. The reason we use so many American casks here is because at the end of Prohibition in the States in the 1930s, times were tough, there was no money, there were few jobs. So to create a wee bit more employment for the men in the areas of the distilleries, we have our whisky laws here in Scotland, the Americans have theirs. They managed to introduce a law to say they can only use their cask once. So, and you can see why. In Scotland here, an apprenticeship to become a cooper to build casks, about 7 years now. The apprenticeship lasts for 7 years. You can become a brain surgeon after 5 years. So it's obviously years of hope. Well, no, yeah. Building, of course, not out here. The archway that you see directly opposite there is this one here. So, in relation.
That's the only thing that's remaining now.
No. The archway opposite there is here. So, in relation to that, we are about here somewhere. You can see from this, the monks planted the fruit trees, they cultivated the land, they planted the forests to harvest for the timber. Anybody heard of William Wallace, Scottish hero? He passed through the archway there after his last battle on Scottish soil, just up the hill here, Battle of Black Ernside. He did defeat the English army that day, and he rested for a few days with about 200 of his men in the abbey here. So maybe they had a drink of the aquavitae or washed their face in it. It wasn't long after that he was captured and came to a sticky end in London, of course. Yeah, that was William Wallace, not Mel Gibson. So, remember the monks built their abbey here. This is the old stables. From here on, it's all new. So you can't just build something new like this on land adjacent to an ancient building like the abbey without archaeologists being involved, first of all, to make sure nothing's going to be destroyed or disturbed. So for hundreds of years it was imagined the extent of the abbey. You're asking was this it? Is this what was here? So for hundreds of years we thought what we can still see was the Abbey, which would be like this area here more or less. The archaeologists came in and they discovered under the ground here old walls and ditches and foundations. So the Abbey had actually been much larger than we imagined previously. Remember, they picked the spot here to build it. It's on the banks of the river. It was good for transport, communication in these days. Another reason they picked this spot, they needed a supply of fresh water, as we all do, of course. Despite the fact the Abbey is on the banks of the river here, we're not far from the North Sea. The River Tay here is tidal, so the tide comes and goes. So the monks couldn't use the water from the river, and neither could we. So another reason they picked this spot, this is it on the drawing. Immediately out the back of the Abbey here, of the distillery rather, was a wee stream. In Scotland here, of course, we call a stream a burn. The monks christened this the Holy Burn. So that was the source of the fresh water for the Abbey. So when the distillery was being built here, we wanted to do things as traditionally as possible, as closely as possible to the way the monks did. Nowadays, unfortunately, there's simply not enough water in the burn to satisfy the demand in the distillery here. We didn't want any dead sheep floating down off the hill or anything. So we couldn't use the water in the burn, but we did the next best thing. Immediately beside the burn, we sunk a borehole, 90 metres deep. So we draw water from there to make our whisky. So we're off to a good start. Fantastic, pure, fresh water. Takes hundreds of years for the water to filter down to that depth, and then we take it out. So that's great. So that's the first ingredient. Second ingredient we need, of course, is the barley. So all the barley that we use in here now is grown for us, especially in the surrounding fields. This gentleman's sister and her husband run the farm next door here, so they grow barley on the farm, and it ends up in here for us to make our whisky, so that's great. So we're the same as the monks were, remember? Before we make whisky, we brew beer. So before we can use the barley to make our beer, it has to go through what's called the malting process. So we don't do that in here, it's a specialised job. It's done just a few miles from here again, so that's great. So our barley is delivered into a hopper outside here, ready malted, ready for us to use. Now part of the malting process involves drying the barley. So if you want to introduce peat into your whisky, you can do that at this stage. Everybody know what peat is?
Yep.
I don't think they'll have peat in India. You not heard of peat? Peated whisky? I'll show you if you want it. Okay, thanks. So this is a little piece of peat. It's a fuel. It's a wee bit similar to coal. Coal starts life as trees, obviously. You've got peat in Poland, I know that. But peat is small, short vegetation, small plants that gets consumed into the ground over thousands of years in cold, wet, muddy areas, peat bogs. That's why we have lots of peat in Scotland here. So it forms like mud. So you dig it, you stack it in fields, and in the hot summer weather that we have here, it dries in the sun. And you can use it as a fuel. So you burn it, it gives off heat obviously, but it also emits a strong pungent smoke. So if you're drying your barley above the burning peat, the barley absorbs some of the smoky, peaty flavour. But remember the dotted line on the window here, the road out here, we want to make a lowland style whisky. So nowadays in the lowland areas of Scotland, there's not an awful lot of peat left. So today, to make a lowland style whisky, you wouldn't normally use peat to dry the barley, so we don't. Ours is just dried in a kiln, like a big dryer. Other parts of the country, of course, the Highlands, West Coast, some of the islands, still lots of peat left. So some distilleries still use peat to dry the barley until they're banned from using it to save the planet, of course. Don't know what they're going to do then. So if you've ever tasted brands of whisky, if you like the malt whiskies, you've probably tasted brands like Lafroy or Lagavulin from Ireland on the west coast. You know what a peaty whisky tastes like. It's alright if you like to drink TCP or disinfectant. It's not my style of whiskey, but it's good. There's such a variety. They're not all the same. That's great. So our barley is delivered to a hopper outside here. Comes along the pipe, along this line, down through this machine. This is our mill. 2 pairs of steel rollers in there. First pair cut the husks, The second pair grind it into what's called the grist, ready for us to use. It goes in here into the grist bin. We normally do that in the morning before we start work, so the grist is freshly milled each day. So this is a sample of our grist, just like wholemeal flour, like porridge, nothing added, nothing taken away. So you want to maybe just pass it up to the end here. So that's two ingredients you know about, the water and the barley. The third ingredient we need is the yeast. We need the yeast to perform the fermentation to convert the sugar that's in the grist into alcohol. That's why we're here after all, we make booze. So yeast is a naturally occurring phenomenon. It's everywhere in nature. It's in the trees, it's in the grass, it's in here, on our air, on our clothes. So the strain of yeast that we use here, it's a genuine Scotch whisky strain. It was isolated in the distillery in Scotland here, so we know it was doing a good job, producing a good spirit. And it's dried, dehydrated, vacuum packed in foil packs of 10 kilograms, and it's produced for us by a company called Lalamans, who are based in Montreal in Canada. Just like the guy's t-shirt. And a number of years ago now, I worked for Lalamans, for the yeast company, for 10 years, selling yeast to make alcohol. I was part of a team of about 20 of us that operated around the world. From the grist bin, it goes in here, and we add 15,000 litres of hot water. There's different sugar compounds in the barley, so we add the water at 3 different temperatures, dissolves the different sugar compounds. Process takes about 4.5 hours. At the end of that period, we're left with a hot sugary liquid called the wort. That's what we're after. Gets transferred in pipes under the floor over to one of these 4 wooden vessels over here, ready for the fermentation. And in here, we're left with a big pot full of the spent grain, or the brewer's draft it's called. It's like a big pot full of porridge. It's no good to us any longer. We've taken all the sugar from it, but we don't want to waste anything, remember? So it goes to the farm next door here. Very nutritious for cattle feed. Yeah, the cattle love it, it's good for it. So it goes, there's nothing wasted, it goes round in circles. So the farm next door grows the barley, comes in here, we extract the sugar from it. Spent grain, the draft goes back, the cattle eat it, they fertilise the ground of course. Farmer grows more barley, it comes back here, so it's just like the circle of life, so it's fat, nothing wasted. So we'll just that because we're hoping, like you said, we get some flavour profile, some advantage from the wood that you wouldn't get obviously from stainless steel. And also, the longer, the slower the fermentation. It is, as I said, at the start of the tour, if you want to, you can go and have a look around in the Abbey, just go through the archway there, say hi to William Wallace, where he passed through. We'll give you a booklet at the reception downstairs. It gives you all the information in there. A lot of people have been buried and murdered in there, of course, over the centuries. I've got another 1 or 2 in mind, but that's a different story to add to it. So you can see lovely views into the Abbey Ruin. You can see Dundee in the distance there. If you really want to see Dundee, that's it. Do you want to come down just a wee bit, ladies, so you can see, because you can see how large, we're okay there boys, you can see how large the Abbey was, because parts of it extended around the side here.
Wow. Any idea how many monks actually stayed in the Abbey at
Only
the time?
30 at a time.
Really?
Maximum was 30. Yes. You tell He's definitely not getting a gold star.
Yeah.
You see the shape that's cut into the field? That's what we use for our emblem, our logo. There it's there. It's the bear and the ragged staff. Oh. It's like a bear holding onto an old tree stump. A lot of people, again, there's nobody from England here, a lot of people from England recognise that. It's actually the emblem for the county of Warwickshire. You know Warwickshire, wee county in England?
Yeah, Warwickshire.
Yeah, there's a wee town there, Stratford upon Avon. There's a guy with a funny beard. % alcohol. These small casks that you see here.
It smells wonderful in here.
That we can use. These are firkins. There's about 50 litres in each of these. This one here, the first rack, this is American Standard bourbon cask. There's 195, 200 litres in each of these. The large ones that you see
Is
here.
that a hogshead, sorry? Is that a hogshead you call that?
No, that's just a bourbon standard American.
Okay.
Hogshead's a bit larger.
Yeah.
Like the one up above it there maybe. Or the one above there.
Yeah.
That's a hoggy, that's a hogshead. Oloroso sherry, the large ones, you see it on the end there, about 500 litres in each of these. There's different types of sherry. This is Oloroso, there's Montelago style.
So, if I'm correct, the whiskey spends some time in these barrels, those sherry barrels. These are bourbon barrels, those sherry barrels, and then another one down there. So 3 different kinds. This is the very non-technical regurgitation of what I just heard. Spend some time equally in those 3 barrels, and then into the plastic barrels, and then bottled right here on site. I recognize that hard cider.
Although the Aquavita is not whiskey, the strength is still 40. Okay? So it's delicious. Remember, it's got lots of spices, lots of herbs, dried fruit in it. So the best way to try it for the first time is on its own. That way you get all the flavours, the herbs, the spices, etc. Sometimes people will say if I was drinking vodka or gin, I wouldn't drink it neat like that. What can I add to it? It's really versatile, it goes well with lemonade, soda, tonic, makes fun.
This is the Aqua Vita.
I've got a wife just like you.
I'm gonna teach her to drive a standard one of these days.
It's not technically a whiskey.
Young ones out?
This is what the monks would have made for the king.
Sorry, did you say you were driving, sir?
I'm driving, yeah.
So they
But you're not, Kevin.
You're driving. Okay.
Cheers.
Cheers.
Zanzibar, good health.
Cheers.
Well, just prove it. Just prove it. I had an old lady, she was an absolute star, 96 years old, came on the tour. She said that this, don't bother with, I don't like whiskey. So have a wee taste, you know, you never know. So she had the Aquavita, they fucked to a whoosh. Everybody was like, and then came to the whiskey. She said, I don't like, I don't like whiskey. And she went, oh, like that.
Oh my
I
god.
learned how to like whiskey when I'm 96 years old. So she was absolutely fantastic. Lovely person. So just take your time with the drinks. I just want to explain a wee bit. The glasses that you have for the whiskey, these are specially designed nosing glasses, with professional nosing tasting whiskies, Glencairn glasses they're called. So before you drink it, give it a swirl around in the glass. You should see the legs on the inside of the glass. Goes by the oils, and then when you come to taste it, or nose it first of all, smell it first of all. Again, I can't tell you what you'll detect because everyone's different. People say it's quite sweet, they get caramel, they get vanilla, like toffee apple type flavours, and then cup your second hand over it, get your nose right inside it, have a good smell. And then when you come to taste it, you're not in a nightclub knocking it back. Remember? Swirl it around in your mouth. You get the texture, it's very creamy, very smooth, really very delicious, quite pleasant. Lincoln, they have the right to tell everybody else how to drink their whiskey. Don't ever put water in your whiskey. You should never put ice in your whiskey, all that crap. Don't listen to them. I used to stand behind the bar and I've read all the manuals. I can't see anywhere that says you're not allowed to put water in your whiskey. My father lived until he was 93. He liked soda water.
Just wrapping up the distillery tour here at Lindores Distillery. It was really informative and just incredible listening to the stories of how the monks used to make whiskey for the king in hundreds of years ago. And this is basically the birthplace of whiskey. And it's just incredible to be here. I mean, if you're going to visit one distillery while in Scotland, this is probably the one to be at. And just the fact that it's right at the base of my sister and my brother-in-law's farm is also just incredible. So we're gonna walk back. Oh, actually, my brother-in-law came to pick us up. We could walk back very easily. I think we're gonna pop into town and grab some basics for dinner, grab some red wine. But this tour, it was definitely incredible. Just soaking in all the history, and it's a once in a lifetime experience. So if you're ever in Scotland, I highly suggest coming to do this tour and checking it out. Really glad we came and did this. Oh, and the whiskey and the aquavite was really tasty. Actually, I actually liked the aquavite better. It was a little bit more floral, and just like the flavor of it. The whiskey was, I'm just not like a huge whiskey aficionado or connoisseur, so it's hard for me to tell the differences between the whiskeys, but I really like the aquavite, which is also kind of cool that the aquavite is what the monks would have actually made for the king originally. So it was good to taste both right here on site. I think I'm gonna walk across the road and actually see the actual ruins of the old abbey now, where the monks used to live. At the back of the distillery here now, or, you know, right across the small road, is the ruins of the monastery. Walking underneath the archway that William Wallace also walked under. This is just historic grounds right here. You can see all the old walls and footings. There's Park Hill Farm right up there. I was told that no more than 30 monks at a time would live here. Wallace marched here. See, I wasn't lying, folks. I gotta take some pictures back here. Brayden went back to the car, but I wasn't gonna pass this up. There's a good shot of the distillery from the back.